following commercials were aired in 2009 and were not aired in 2024. A lot of these promotions and sales are not even existent to this day. The Middle was actually one of our favorite shows growing up, and that's the reason why I included the commercials in this, to emphasize the commercials that we would be watching during the TV show's airing. So, these commercials are not meant for any commercial usage, and any other usage of the following footage without the direct consent of the publisher is strictly prohibited. All rights are reserved to these stations.
Are you?
We want to help you wake up happy and pain-free. Our name says it all. Furniture for less.
Come on. There's a hidden little spot down a lone dirt road. Come on. Where the stars come out and the moonlight glows. Come on. Yeah, let me take you down where the honeysuckle grows. Come on.
Curry, go see him.
Baby, tell me, is that sweet enough?
Silverado starting at $199 a month.
I always say winning is a daily process. We're a team that plays smart. We're a team that's going to play hard. And we're going to play physical. That's what it's going to take to win. Let's get it rocking and rolling. Win today.
6 News asks, want more cash?
Show me the money.
Simple step-by-step plan to save.
Show me the money.
Stretch.
Show me the money.
And make more moolah.
Show me the money.
On your side, only on 6 News.
Welcome to a brand new episode of Keeping Up with the Middle. It's been 2 weeks because I was actually on the 4th of July weekend. I enjoyed that with my family. Not only that, but we were actually on vacation for the first time, so we actually had a lot of fun on the 4th of July weekend, so that's why I was out those 2 weeks, because not only was I trying to basically get myself afloat financially, I've also been trying to help out my family as well, as this podcast is a great deal of help. I just saw today something very interesting. We have one of the highest rated shows just aired. That was episode 2, was the interview at Morgenstern's with Sean Cohen. And it got me thinking a lot about the future of this podcast. And yeah, we're not that greatly reviewed. I mean, we got 3.7 out of 5 stars, which is mediocre. I know there's some things that we can do better. I have some more guests coming on soon. And when I mean soon, I mean it's going to not be guaranteed on what day and time when we're actually going to have these people come on. But I do plan to have these people come on. But I did think to myself, why don't we include small business owners or people making a difference or even crime journalists and do that as part of our podcast? And that is exactly what I am going to do. Because believe it or not, the Cinderella Slippers podcast and some of those other ones that I've been airing on here, I believe Cinderella Slippers, just to clarify to everybody, if I kept promising and promising and promising and promising and promising, which I did. I kept promising and promising and promising that we were going to be airing those episodes about football. Yes, we are. But again, I've been taking summer courses. I'm starting my final semester in college ever. And it's going to be taking a lot of my time. So nothing is going to be guaranteed. I am hiring an editor. And I'm hoping that him and I can actually work together and get a lot of these videos done. And he's fine not getting paid or getting paid as well. So I have a lot on my plate. And if I keep promising and then it doesn't deliver, life happens. Life always has to happen for me. And life not only tends to be happening in snowballs, it tends to be happening in my own personal perspective of hosting a podcast and keeping that regularly updating and going. We will be on here every Thursday or Friday, varied on the week, and maybe 2 weeks every Thursday and Friday. do not take these plans to heart and be like, oh, well, Braydyn, you're being disloyal. No, I'm not. I'm really not. It's just my life is busy, and I'm really on the home stretch of college. So I've been really focusing on that before I start getting into the workforce. And then we'll figure out a brand new schedule for this podcast and all sorts of stuff. And then we had 3 name changes this year. I started with Braydyn the Television. It wasn't doing that well as Braydyn the Television. Then I switched it over to Hickory Productions. Wasn't doing well as Hickory Productions. But now I've switched it to a name that I will keep, and it's called Keeping Up with the Middle. So that is going to be not only the name of this podcast, but the name of this channel and the podcast itself. But yes, that was a little bit of my announcements. I welcome you all again to this week's episode, which today we have a very exciting episode that was recorded all the way back in late February that I forgot to actually post on here. And if you want to find this footage that has been posted before I somehow, some way take it off of the computer full time, it's an interview I did with a man by the name of Kevin Finch, who I did a project on back in the spring of last semester in college. And so as we're ramping up for school and everything, and a lot of people are finding work, I'm hoping that this could provide a little bit of help for you, as this is a culture podcast instead of it being tailored towards particular things. So I'm hoping that this Kevin Finch interview would really help you guys have more of a broader perspective on the world of journalism and on the world of broadcast media. Kevin Finch was a famous broadcaster for over 40 years, got multiple degrees. He teaches at a college, Washington and Lee College in Virginia, and he's a professor, and he's been doing some incredible work. And throughout this interview that I did with him, I did it for the Indiana Broadcast Archives, Indiana State Broadcast Archives, something like that. And I was able to broadcast that onto their website, which the link is down in the description of this podcast, wherever you get your podcasts, on Spotify, iHeartRadio, YouTube, wherever. Yes, we're on YouTube, trying to earn some cash. But it's a really good interview. I had a really good sit down with him back in late February. I wanted to post this a lot sooner, but I didn't because my sister was really sick. My mom was really sick between March, April, and May. They were hard months for me, but March, actually not so much, but April and May, absolutely. But it's been a rocky year to say the least, and that's part of the reason why I have been very inconsistent, and I apologize about that. Every single time I apologize about that, it doesn't seem to get better and better and better, but I'm hoping it gets better with you guys. But yeah, this interview with Kevin Finch took place right before the month of March and right before the NCAA tournament. And so I wanted to really, and believe it or not, I'll give you a backstory on this. When I interviewed him, it was during a snow day. Like, the campus at IU was closing early, and at South, Brianna's, or at the high school, Brianna's, or my sister's school, high school, was also closing early that day. So I had about an hour to do this interview. We got it all done in less than an hour because I had heard beforehand school was canceled for Brianna, my sister, because of the fact that there was snow on the ground and there was going to be a massive blizzard coming through Indiana, which that was actually ultimately the case. And that's exactly what happened. But I will say that this interview was a fun one to do. It lasts about a good 50 minutes. There's points he gets on his phone, but and he had to interrupt me for a few minutes just to interview or actually talk to some of his professors and colleagues because he was working that day, and I was actually trying to interrupt him during some work hours, but he was willing to sit down with us for the Broadcast Archives, and I'll give you a little bit of background on the Broadcast Archives. The Indiana University Broadcast Archives are probably the most historical pieces of footage in the media world in Indiana. Kevin was a broadcaster for a lot of Indiana stations, and worked as a producer and worked on Calamari Pictures or Calamari Productions, and he was able to help out with a lot of the juvenile delinquency justice, social justice issues, stuff like that. And he documented it on podcasts that were aired on podcasts and on television shows that were aired on the National Geographic and on Lockup on MSNBC. So he's done a lot of incredible work. And I'm not going to say anymore. I hope you guys enjoy this interview that we did all the way back in February. My apologies for not posting this a lot sooner. I would have if nothing else would have happened. Enough of me talking.
Then,
Let's enjoy the interview.
Me to ask you two other questions, which were, where were you born? Where did you grow up? And what were some of your first memories in journalism and broadcasting?
I was born in Peoria, Illinois. And I grew up nearby in a little town called Eureka. Eureka's, if it has any fame, it's because it has a tiny little college there where a former broadcaster went to school, who later became president of the United States, Ronald Reagan. So I'm a creature of media. I'm a creature of news media and other media. When I was a little kid, my parents subscribed to Life magazine, which was a great way, even though it was written for adults, it was a great way for kids to get into the news because it was mostly pictures, great photographs, small little stories to accompany these great photographs. And that's how I kind of caught up. And then they had Paul Harvey, the syndicated radio guy, on to his, in particular, conservative stance on the news, but he certainly covered the news. And then just the nightly newscasts. And my folks were very good about history. They woke me up when Bobby Kennedy was shot. They woke me up when Martin Luther King was shot. Said, you need to see this. You need to sit here in front of the TV and watch this. And I was not even 9 years old yet. So they recognized that my mom had a great sense of history, and so I was always around that world. And the nightly newscast was something that people watched back then. You watched either Walter Cronkite, or you watched Huntley and Brinkley on NBC, or maybe Frank Reynolds, or before that, the first version of Peter Jennings, or any other people that ABC had. And of course, what were the big stories? The Vietnam War, civil rights, and related things. And so it was part of my growing up, was all that kind of thing. So it wasn't a stretch for me to want to go into broadcast journalism, because that's how I kind of got started.
I knew you talked a little bit about the Bobby Kennedy assassination. Can you describe a little more how that deeply impacted you and how it related to you wanting to get into history and journalism?
Well, even before the Bobby Kennedy, I don't remember the day of the assassination of his brother, John F. Kennedy, but I do remember, it's like my first television memory was sitting in front on the floor of the front of the TV set. And the TV sets back then were, and we had like a 25-inch black and white TV set, the way they were, and which was sitting there with my dad watching the funeral caisson go by, with the horse with the rider with the boots and in the opposite direction in the stirrups and all that kind of stuff. And that's one of my first TV memories, is sitting with my dad watching that Kennedy funeral. And so the Bobby Kennedy thing was, and it's not like my household was this, Kennedy worshiping family. It was just that it was so tragic, and it was, it's like, what is the deal with this family? How do they keep having all these horrible things happen? And so I certainly, remember following it. And then, of course, Life magazine the next week, huge coverage of it, including the very famous photograph of the waiter or kitchen helper who was there at Bobby Kennedy's side as he was lying there dying. So all of that sort of thing, those were early memories, just as, some of the horrible things like the Asian American monk who set himself on fire to protest the Vietnam War, things like that. These are images, and they were a big part of my childhood. And years later, when I had my first TV news reporting job, I was based in Champaign, Illinois, but they had a sister station in Peoria. And so one of my childhood friends looked at me and said, I saw him one time when I was back home for Christmas, and he said, Hey, newsman. And I thought I could deal with that. I can, that's not a bad title.
Okay, so you spoke at the end about being the newsman. Did you, I mean, when you did go to college, did you go to college to pursue journalism or film?
Yes, back then they had a major at a lot of universities that sounds very quaint now. It's all, we have different names for things now, but back then my major was radio and television. That was a major, and that's what it was. So I majored in radio and television, and had a a desire to go in that direction. I wasn't quite sure which part of it I was going to do, actually. A little bit of a candy store effect where I could do a little of this, I could do a little of that, that sort of thing. But I knew it was going to be something in broadcasting, and that was my motivation. And yeah, it was an easy choice.
And so describe to me a little bit more about the stories you covered in college and what kind of journalism experiences, like making films or that sort of stuff in college.
In college, it was all well, no, it was almost all daily type news coverage. For instance, I remember working for the student newspaper and covering. We busted the head of public safety and showed him parking in a handicapped parking spot. A little bit of a little bit of investigative journalism. You have to remember that when I was in school in college in the late 70s, it was in the aftermath of Watergate. Everybody wanted to be the next Woodward and Bernstein, even on the broadcast side. We wanted to be the broadcast version of Woodward and Bernstein. That was so much of what drove an entire generation of journalists, people who are now in their 60s for the most part, maybe even some in their upper 50s, that sort of thing. Where it's like, man, we've got to get in on this. We've got to do this kind of, that has this huge impact that, is not just covering history or first draft of history, but is changing history. And that was the motivation for a whole generation of journalists, was that. I just showed the movie All the President's Men in a class I teach here the other day, probably for the 100th time, and when in the film, when Hal Holbrook playing Deep Throat says to Robert Redford playing Woodward, "Get out your notebook, there's more," I can still think that had to be the biggest rush you could ever hear when a highly placed source has all this great information. Oh my gosh. So that, that was the motivating factor. But we would cover, like, I remember there was an anti-Iran demonstration when I was in college because of the hostages, where there were all these American hostages who were stuck in Iran for a total of 444 days. And so, which included a lot of misunderstanding of what Iran was, which was not an Arab country. It was a Middle Eastern country. It is a Middle Eastern country. It's not Arab. But all of that kind of sentiment and that sort of thing. So it was a demonstration, but it wasn't a 60s demonstration. It wasn't a peace demonstration. It wasn't the stuff that the people a half generation removed from me were covering. It was a demonstration that was very much against a country that we felt, at the time was our enemy. And that's one of my first memories of something to cover. And then, I did a documentary, a small, short documentary that never played anywhere, a friend of mine, on the rising price of vinyl records versus the decreasing quality. And that was the hard-hitting stuff, man. They were taking us to the cleaners on the cost of an album, and they were cranking out lousy quality albums, and we were getting to the bottom of it. So that's some of the stuff I did in college.
So do you remember what your career goals were after you got out of school?
I just remember that I wasn't sure what they were. I had the most prestigious internship you could have in broadcasting, the International Radio Television Society internship in New York. They call it a fellowship now. A whole summer in New York City, all expenses paid, and I worked for ABC, and I was assigned to the radio division at the time, and I had a great summer. And it was sort of like, now what do I do? Well, I could go off in this direction. I could be a radio DJ. I could do, see if I can get into TV, maybe on the production side. I could do this, I could do that. And so that indecision, marked my first few years in the career. And I can't believe that anybody in this oral history project would care that much about my little indecision. I know we're building to the stuff that's more about the history of Indianapolis broadcasting, but anyway, you're asking the questions, and that's my answer for that.
Okay, so at the stations you worked at, WTHR, were there any specific stories you remember from your time there, or mentors you remember, some of the high and low points?
Yeah, I remember a whole lot about that. I'd been working in the 1980s. Well, I actually did radio DJ work. I was an FM radio DJ in Peoria, Illinois at WWCT Peoria. It was what they called then an AOR, album oriented rock station. And I was like, that's not really, I loved it, but I had to get serious. I needed to refocus. So I went to grad school, University of Illinois, Springfield, to get back into news, to get back on track. And I took a job at WCIA TV in Champaign for 4 years as a producer and as a reporter. And then I came to THR in 1990, and it was a really interesting time in Indianapolis television and really Indianapolis media. In 1990 was the year there were a bunch of new alternative newspapers that came out in Indianapolis. One that was called Nuvo, that I think still exists in some form. One was called 12X, and there were some others. So it was a very vibrant scene for that. The Indianapolis Business Journal was up and running at that time already. The Indianapolis News still existed, the Indianapolis Star, all that sort of thing. They were still locally owned. And then I came to WTHR, which was sort of regionally owned. It was owned by the Wolf family, WOLFE, and they were based in Columbus, Ohio, and they were also the owners of WBNS, AM/FM TV in Columbus. BNS is a CBS affiliate. They owned a magazine, an insurance company, a stock brokerage firm, a whole lot of stuff, a lot of land, a huge real estate owner. And they owned this one TV station in Indianapolis. And it was a nice, newer facility and had some very talented people. But overall, it was mired in third place when I got there in 1990. We were the only station in the market that had a helicopter, a Bell Jet Ranger helicopter. And we had amazingly talented photographers, some very good reporters. We had really well-known and respected weather and sports people. A guy named Bob Gregory, who's a local legend. He's still around Indianapolis right now. And Don Hine was the sports guy. A very super well-respected guy who's in the Indiana Journalism Hall of Fame and I think in the Broadcast Pioneers Hall of Fame, named Tom Cochran, who was a known investigative reporter, won a national Emmy for exposing a resurgence of the Klan in the 1980s. So it was this great cast of characters, but it just kind of like was stuck in third place. And so my early memories are just getting used to being in a large market and getting used to the level of quality of photographic journalism there was at that station and in the market overall. It's a very competitive TV market in a sense, but in another sense, it's like, okay, WRTV Channel 6 was the overall #1. They had Howard Caldwell as the dean of local anchors, very serious kind of Walter Cronkite personage. They had Wish TV had Mike Ahern. He'd been there decades. He was a poet when he wasn't being a broadcaster. He was paired a long time with Debbie Knox. I mean, it was very entrenched and very locked in. And, Wish could win some things, RTV could win others. And if we won anything at all back then, it was morning news, and morning news didn't pay. Morning news at the time, now it's huge, but morning news in 1990, wasn't getting much per spot that you would buy. And, even if it had viewers, advertisers didn't think about buying morning news like they do now. They would buy the 5 o'clock, the 6 o'clock, and sometimes the 11 o'clock. And so we were this third place station. So those are my early memories, high quality people, but was just kind of like not really going anywhere. And there were some major stories back then, but it just seemed like it took off at about the same time. And this is my bias from being, at one of those stations. as WTHR was on its ascendancy, was about the time that news got more interesting. I think there were more big stories by the mid-90s. And also with a new news director who really pushed us to be more big market and to do big coverage big, which sounds redundant, but it meant something. Things were changing. And, you know, if you asked about individual stories that we covered, big stories, I'm trying to think, like, okay, for instance, in 1994, President Clinton came to town to break ground on a new monument to commemorate Dr. Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, because Bobby Kennedy was campaigning for president in Indiana in the spring of '68. He'd been in Muncie and was informed as he was leaving Muncie that King had been shot in Memphis. And he was warned not to give a speech where he had planned to at 17th and Broadway, which is a neighborhood in Indianapolis that back then was described as rough or something like that. There were probably other pejorative terms. And he ignored the advice of the mayor and local police, and he went to this rally anyway. And things were very different back then. And so he was the one who broke the news to most of the crowd who hadn't heard it. No social media, no internet. And they didn't know until he gets on and says, I have some terrible news for everybody. Martin Luther King was shot and killed tonight in Memphis. And you hear this scream when that happened. Wish TV may have had some of the only film of that. As a matter of fact, network TV, CBS, had a camera problem. And so they came to the local station to get that, which is a good separate story for you guys to look into sometime. President Clinton came to town with Martin Luther King III and with Ethel Kennedy, Bobby's widow, to hang on a second. I've got a call. If you don't mind, I'm just going to shut this off or whatever. So
sounds good. Yeah, now we're good.
Okay. All right. All right. So we were talking about that. So Bill Clinton comes to Indianapolis in the spring of 1994 with Martin Luther King III and with Ethel Kennedy and others to break ground for this new monument at 17th and Broadway, just north of downtown Indianapolis, to mark this occasion where Kennedy told this crowd that King had been killed. And it was a really amazing day in 1994 when this happens. We did some stories about the actual event back in 1968, that sort of thing. We talked to some people who were there. All the stations did, all this, you know, the newspapers, everybody covered it. But it was also happened to be, it was on a Saturday, and it was also poll day at the Indianapolis 500 at the Motor Speedway, poll day leading up to the race. And it was also the Indiana Pacers in the second round of the NBA playoffs for the first time since the Pacers moved from the ABA to the NBA. All three things were going in on the same day. And there was also a fundraiser event for President Clinton at the Indiana Convention Center. And so there was no weekend morning news on television in Indianapolis in 1994. So WTHR, under the direction of a news director named John Butte, who was a Southern Indiana native and a graduate of IU, John tells us, we're going to cover all of this. And so that meant a crew at the airport for Air Force One coming in, a crew at the convention center where this fundraiser was going to take place later, multiple crews at the site at 17th and Broadway where all these famous politicians were coming to break ground for this event. Crew at what was then Market Square Arena, where the Pacers were getting into the NBA playoff second round for the first time in their history, and crews at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, where it was poll day, which is always a big deal. And so, you know, live here, live there, everywhere, all that kind of stuff, and for a whole morning show. And that was a bit of groundbreaking local television. And that was an example of the kind of things that were happening here in Indianapolis at that time, among others. I mean, you know, like in '95, Michael Jordan decides to come out of retirement from basketball. He'd been playing minor league baseball, and the first game back is at Market Square Arena against the Pacers. And so that was a national media circus. Everybody's there. All these sports channels, even, cable news channels. Michael Jordan is coming back to play basketball, and it happened in our backyard. Within a week of that, and I don't remember, it's in March of 1995. I don't remember if it was the week before or the week after. On that weekend, Mike Tyson was let out of prison. The boxer was at a prison in the Plainfield area, west of Indianapolis, and had been serving a 3-year sentence for rape. And he was released from prison that very day, again, like a week either before or after Jordan coming back to play basketball. And we were all over that, covering all these different angles from that. Was he going to stop at a mosque because supposedly he may have been converted to Islam while he was in prison? Was he, where was he going to go? Where was the airplane? Was he flying back to Cleveland? All that kind of stuff. And we had, again, multiple crews for all of those things. So just a lot of big event kind of things that were happening back then. A hostage crisis at a Denny's restaurant was another one, among others. And so the level of competition in Indianapolis TV started to rise, and then the establishment of weekend morning newscasts. And well, it can't just be one station, so another station gets in and another station gets in. Investigative units start doing deeper and more thorough investigations, and it becomes this highly competitive landscape. And at the same time, also, we were included in an Emmy chapter, regional Emmy chapter in Cleveland, which nobody really entered much except for Channel 6. And so by the mid-90s, that was changing. Now everybody's entering the Emmys. And the Cleveland people are angry with Indianapolis because Indianapolis starts winning so many of the Emmys. So this competitive level just keeps rising and rising. The quality is just getting better and better. And it was a very heady time to be in local news in Indianapolis in the 90s.
And so you made a great point on the stories that you brought up, because that actually leads us to our next question. You were actually a part of an award-winning piece called In the Child's Best Interest. Is that correct?
Wow, you did your homework. Yeah. As a matter of fact, back there, next to those Emmys, you can't see it because it's see-through acrylic. That's a National Edward R. Murrow Award, right there. And that's for In the Child's Best Interest, which won a whole bunch of awards, one of those regional Emmys and but it won some national recognition too. And it was historic because the Indiana State Supreme Court gave our lead reporter on this and producer, Karen Graw, exclusive access to Indiana juvenile courtrooms and holding facilities and the like. That's the kind of place where you and I can go into any courthouse any place in America and sit down and watch a murder trial. And neither one of us can go into a juvenile court facility unless we're directly involved, unless we have a kid in there or we're a guardian ad litem or something like that. And yet there we were with cameras in juvenile courts. It was pretty groundbreaking stuff.
And so my question to you was, what were some of the biggest challenges you had documenting children, including talking about civil rights for children?
Well, it's even more fundamental than civil rights, which really didn't become a thing in America until the 1960s. It was more about just a fundamental right to self-determination, a right not to be abused, a right not to be neglected, a right to have someone represent them and try to represent their interests. It's difficult stuff because the subject matter is very hard. Sometimes it's heartbreaking. And it was also came with a stipulation that up to the moment of the broadcast, if we had heard from one of the families that we featured who suddenly got cold feet, we had committed to removing them from the documentary film. So, and nobody did, but that was pretty nerve-wracking. It really did have a major impact, I think, because we played the documentary in prime time. we followed it with an hour-long live discussion, and that included some amazing things that happened. For instance, there was a huge increase in the number of people who volunteered to become CASA, court-appointed special advocates for children, throughout central Indiana, where this thing ran. It also ran on WFYI, the PBS affiliate, as part of what the court stipulated, that there would be an educational component to it. So it had this increase in volunteerism, huge increase in calls in to report possible examples, incidents of domestic, child abuse or neglect, all that kind of stuff. So it had major impact, but it was hard work, and it was also it was emotionally draining work, especially more for Karen, who was the lead reporter on the thing, and the great photographers, the Hall of Famer Steve Starnes, and also John Whalen, two extraordinary photographers who did the bulk of the work on that. And if you hear case after case after case of this dysfunction or that problem or whatever, it's tough. But I think we still put together an hour of compelling television, and people learned from it. It wasn't just, here, we're going to depress you for the next hour, enjoy. Instead, it's a learning opportunity to understand a murky part of the world that most of us are never exposed to.
And so another question I had was, when we're talking about prison and that sort of stuff, what are some takeaways that you saw as a producer and as a journalist on how to appropriately cover hard topics like this, especially with we are working at reality TV?
Well, I wouldn't say I didn't do any work in reality television. I just did documentary work. I've never done reality TV stuff. I think there's a line between the two. And my friend Karen Graw, who's now out on the West Coast, but has been in that world since she did that documentary. She then did an hour on Dateline of a similar subject matter, 2 hours on MSNBC, and that launched her career. And she's done stuff on ABC News. She's done work on Court TV, MTV, A&E, all this sort of thing. And most of it has been in the juvenile justice area. And I think the thing that all journalists and documentary producers could learn from Karen is that, you have to go in with empathy. You have to go in with patience, and to know that you're not going to turn something quickly, like, oh, I'm going to rush out to prison and I'm going to put a story on the newscast that night. Not that kind of work. In the Child's Best Interest took, I think, 8 months to produce. And her work has continued over the next 20 some years. And in that time, some of those have, bubbled up even over a couple of years. Some of my documentaries since then, my most recent one, took over 4 years. So, patience is a key factor. And as I said, in the case of anything in the prison or juvenile justice area, empathy is a big part of it.
And so you mentioned having interest into the subject, but I recently, even while I was doing research, dug up on an interview about you made a documentary about Kurt Vonnegut from Indianapolis, and you said that looking at it from a perspective of a fan and not an expert really helped you. So what do you mean by being a fan instead of being the expert while you're researching a topic for your stories?
Well, I've been a fan of Kurt Vonnegut since I was a sophomore in high school, and I read Slaughterhouse-Five, which is an extraordinary novel, just groundbreaking in its narrative technique. And then I just kept going. So, I'm not a professor of literature. I don't have a PhD in American literature or anything like that. So I'm not approaching it from the point of view of, some sort of comparative literature analysis or anything like that. I included elements of a lot of his books and that sort of thing, but I didn't make it a lecture. I wanted it to be broadly based, popular enough that people who are just curious and at casual interest might want to hang to hear about his life story. And it's a wonderful life story. It's fascinating. And even his relationship with his home city of Indianapolis, very much a love-hate thing as he grew into adulthood. Loved his wonderful teenage and pre-teenage experience with great teachers, he said, in wonderful schools, amazing opportunities. Shortridge High School back then had a daily newspaper for high school, one of the few in the country, and he got to write for that. So a lot of positives, but also as he started writing his novels and having them published, there were people, especially his own family, who weren't quite sure how to react to the language in them and that sort of thing. And so it was that sort of love-hate thing. So to answer your question about the, the fan perspective is that most of the people who are going to watch a documentary like that are probably going to be more fan oriented than they are going to be serious students of literature. So it's speaking to them directly on that level, sneaking in some of the literature aspects, but also that broader perspective of, hey, Indianapolis, just how big of a guy was this? How big of a deal? He was huge, worldwide huge. Even if you've never read any of his stuff, it might feel good to brag about that this famous, successful guy came from the same city where you live. And that was also in the back of my mind when that was going on.
And so Professor Conway wanted me to ask you this question. Describe what it meant for you to work in a local broadcasting station in a community, like as you mentioned with THR and your work. How did you perceive it compared to other careers?
My old news director, John Butte, said that television, working in television news is a privilege. And I would agree with that and also say it was a wonderful position to be in, to have a front row seat on so much history as it was happening. Another thing that happened in 1995 that changed downtown Indianapolis, and you don't realize it now because it's not in the same state, was the opening of Circle Center Mall. Because there were all these attempts prior to that to sort of bring business back down, come on back downtown. They opened up the old Union Station. They turned it into a so-called festival marketplace, where they had shops that sold left-handed coffee mugs and lots of IU t-shirts, but there wasn't a place you could go if you got a stain on your dress shirt at work. There wasn't a clothing store or anything downtown except, with a couple of outliers. There were hardly any restaurants, and that mall changed all of that. I mean, for a while, Indianapolis was on some list of one-day coach trips to those, those big luxury motor coaches to come into town and drop off people at the mall for the day. Really? Yeah, that's how big it was. And so that spawned within the first 5 years, 50 new restaurants in downtown Indianapolis. So I'm both a resident of the place, of the city, and also a journalist covering the city. And as the city got better and more exciting and downtown got better, it was fun to work in television news. Now, I mean, we weren't boosters. I mean, if there was a high crime area or whatever, we covered that, but we were at the same time right there where all of this was going on. And it felt like that the work we were doing was relevant and meaningful and the kind of thing that was useful to all kinds of different groups in town and individuals.
And so the next question I had was, during your career, what do you think the role of as you mentioned with Indianapolis, having that hometown feel, how is that important into galvanizing a community?
I think it's really important, especially that Indianapolis was able, that the market size was large enough, that the pay scale was such that we could pay people to want to stay around and not just sort of leave after 2 years and go somewhere bigger. I mean, there were people who did that, of course, but there was enough continuity, enough institutional knowledge that there really was a sense that there were people, even if they weren't natives, and I'm not a native of Indianapolis, but a sense of that we're covering the hometown. We're covering this town and we're invested in it. So we're not going to buy into the latest trend or whatever gimmicky techniques in broadcast journalism, and they're out there. Instead, no, we're going to take this seriously. I mean, I had a scuffle in my last job at WRTV. I was just hired there, and my GM asked me to get on the phone with a consultant who was not happy with the way the station was working, because he said that all of their plans to do all of this ultra aggressive investigative stuff with little franchises like Show Me the Money and stuff like, why that's just not working. They're not executing it. And I cut off the guy in the middle of the conversation and I said, do you know what the top 5 employers are in Indianapolis? And he just kind of stopped. What do you mean? So the top 5 employers in Indianapolis, it's the federal government, the state government, IUPUI, Eli Lilly, whatever it was at the time. There were, and I said, there's not a blue collar union in the group. Now, there's certainly a blue collar presence in the viewing area, but my point was, this is not Cleveland. This is not Pittsburgh. This is not Brooklyn. And this idea of this ultra aggressive over the top stuff is a turnoff to viewers. And I knew that because I'd been in the market for more than 20 years. I could say this is a gimmick. It's not working. And I think that's the kind of thing that is really important. And there were lots of people in town. It wasn't me at all. I mean, there were lots of people in town who could also straighten out somebody who was coming in with some sort of a gimmicky approach, that it just wasn't going to work in a city like Indianapolis, because it's a different mood. It's a different culture than in some more traditional smokestack cities farther north and farther east. So I think that's one example of, the sense of place, which is always important. Sense of place is huge in writing and literature, in storytelling, but also, in journalism, so that you're actually talking to your viewers and not talking past them. And I think that's a thing that a lot of people got for being here all these years. Viewers in that area have been very well served, okay, with lots of veterans to guide them through things and have a common reference, a frame of reference between viewer and broadcast journalist. So that's a big advantage, I think.
What is your thoughts now on the role of Indianapolis television, radio, and journalism more today?
Well, I say it, in full disclosure, that it's at a distance. I haven't lived in the city in a little over a decade now. And so, I stay plugged in. I know people who are still on the job. I think that all television is eventually going to follow, local television is eventually going to follow the course of local newspapers. There will be some consolidation. I'm not quite sure how long Indianapolis can sustain 4, because 2 are under the same roof, 4 television newsrooms. Indianapolis in 1965 had 3 newspapers, the 2 owned by the Pulliams and the Scripps paper, the Indianapolis Times. And that's the year 65 is when the Times folded. And so, and then it was 2 for years. One was a morning paper, one was the afternoon paper. And I think that's the model. I think the stations will be healthier financially when one of them is no longer doing TV news. And that's in any city. That's not an Indianapolis thing. I just think that that's me being a professor of broadcast journalism, being able to not be in the middle of it, to stand back at a distance and just say, there's going to be this, in my belief, there's going to be a period in which in a small market like Terre Haute used to have, I think, 3 TV newsrooms, and it has 2. And you think about some others, Fort Wayne, other cities in Indiana. That how long can smaller markets sustain 3 or even 4 TV news operations? I think when one of them goes dark, I think the others will all be healthier in some sort of, Darwinian sense. And they'll all do, I think they'll be in better financial shape and be able to do really good work. Right now, it's still holding on to financially to the way it was years ago, with expectations of 40% profits, in an election year, and still good profits in a non-election year. And I just don't know how sustainable that is if everybody's eating out of the same pie right now. So I don't want that to sound gloomy. I want that to sound realistic, that on the other side of that, I think things will be really good again. Right now, I'm not so sure. The partnerships that stations started in the 1990s, I was assigned to be leading the partnership between WTHR and the Indianapolis Star. I think those were good forward-thinking ideas at the time. Not all of them were well executed. Much of it was too much about just cross-promotion, not shared newsroom work. There was some, but not nearly enough. It was just WTHR teasing what was in the Star mentioning occasionally something that was on Channel 13. I think those things could be done much better, and look for other opportunities like not-for-profits and groups like ProPublica to partner with TV stations to do work, that sort of thing. I think those are things that are in the future that are positive things. Right now, I think stations are going through kind of a sort of an interim period, in my take again, for what it's worth.
And so now we're going to switch gears before we get to the end and discuss journalism in colleges and high schools. So, to any student involved in wanting to either learn or teach journalism and communications in the high school or college level, what are some of the best ways for someone to get from the newsroom to the classroom and lecture?
I think one of the first things you could do, from my experience, was to just start to speak at schools. If you're a professional broadcast journalist, I'm sorry, can you stop this again? I got to get this call. I'm sorry.
No worries.
Thank you.
No worries. We're on again.
Okay, good. So you're asking about what you could do to move from newsroom to classroom. And the first step is to be available to speak at colleges and high schools. And that's how I got my first adjunct teaching position, was I had proof that I'd already been invited to speak. I think first place I spoke was IU South Bend. I had a journalism program at the time, and I was invited by a good friend to come up and talk about what I was doing at the time. I was just a producer at WTHR. And then I continued that. When I was an executive producer, I was teaching at the University of Indianapolis as an adjunct. And then I was still invited all over the place. I spoke at Butler. I spoke at IU. I spoke at Franklin College. So I just kept amassing those and saying yes as often as was possible. And it was in the back of my mind that my second act would be to do just what you said, to move from newsroom to classroom. The only thing I would caution about that is that you asked, how do I get into teaching? The expectation in journalism, where we still argue, are we a profession or a craft? The expectation is it has to involve experience. You can go and get a PhD in some form of journalism and avoid ever actually working in journalism. I think that's a mistake if you're going to teach journalism other than pure theory courses. So if you're asking how to go from newsroom to classroom, you've already made the first important step, which is to be a journalist, because the experience you bring into the classroom is highly valued. In most cases, most universities want to have what I have, which is just a master's degree at a minimum. Master's degree and a lot of experience. I was counseled by two really smart people who had made the transition to academia, who told me that to be considered for especially a tenure track position in journalism, teaching journalism, that you needed the master's degree plus experience as the boss. And I'd already been an executive producer for years, but I became assistant news director and then news director at Wish TV. Matter of fact, that's a whole story about being hired as a combo. Tom Cochran and I were hired as a 1 and a 1A to run that newsroom after the legendary Hall of Famer Lee Giles retired. And then the second job at WRTV. So someone with news director experience, you have to explain to people who don't understand broadcast journalism that that's the equivalent of being an executive editor at a newspaper. That experience is highly desirable in combination with the masters, in combination with actually having boots on the ground, covered big stories, done the work. So it's all those things that are of value to, so, if you're thinking about making that move.
And so the last question I had was, describe what it has meant for you to work at the local broadcasting level, and how did you actually explore other options after you were done?
Well, it was interesting, actually. My career has been doing many of the things that I used to watch or listen to. So that was really rewarding. I listened to this rock and roll radio station in Peoria as a high school student. I ended up working there. How cool is that? I watched the nightly newscast and on NBC or CBS, and the first two stations I worked for in the news departments were a CBS affiliate and an NBC affiliate. That I got to do work on the air as a reporter, that I got to produce, which I didn't know as a kid what a producer was, but the decision maker, the writer, all that sort of thing, that was highly rewarding. And then eventually to be the leader of a couple of shops. All of that was exactly, I couldn't have planned better, than to get to do those things. As a kid, I entertained the network idea, and I even tested that idea in the late 90s, because WTHR gave me so many opportunities. I covered 4 national political conventions, a presidential inauguration. I covered the Senate trial after the impeachment of President Clinton, covered 9/11 in DC, the first anniversary in New York, the bombing of Centennial Olympic Park in Atlanta, 3 Olympic Games, 4 or 5 Final Fours, 2 AFC championships, 1 Super Bowl, and on and on and on. And, that's the good stuff. And that was this kind of a combination. Those are things that networks used to be the only ones to cover. And because of the advent of satellite television, with satellite trucks, we could cover that stuff too. So I had the best of both worlds. I got to cover local things, be in a good community where my kids grew up, and I got to play in some of the biggest arenas, do some of the biggest kinds of journalism, cover some of the biggest stories on the planet, and some of the most historically significant in my career. Wow, I mean, that was great. That was exactly what you'd want to do, what you'd want out of a career. And so I felt very lucky that I got to do all those things. Then, again, in the back of my mind, I thought eventually I'd like to teach it. Before this hair got any grayer, I wanted to be able to actually teach it, and be taken seriously and that sort of thing. And so that's what I chose to do, was to do that. And the place where I am was one of 2 offers I had, and it was nice to be, considered. And so I seized on the opportunity. So all those things turned out, very well for me. And along the way, I also had this other sort of side career, which was I started making documentaries with Tom Cochran and his company, 19 Star Productions, back in the 90s. I wrote my first doc in 1996, and 2 more for him. One that started on Discovery. It was called G-Man, the Making of an FBI Agent. I didn't come up with the title, but I did write the film. And that was on the Discovery Channel in 2002. And one called New York Emergency, which was about the Mayor's Office of Emergency Management in New York. And that was on TLC in 2000. And then I kept going, so those were things I did on the side, even though I had more than a full-time job. And so when I made the transition into teaching full-time, they asked me, would I do research or something else? And I said no to research. I said I'd like to continue to produce documentaries. And so that's what I've done. So I've gotten this other opportunity to do these cool things and have a couple of them seen nationally on PBS stations via American Public Television, like the one that's out right now. And so, wow, how cool is that? So all of that worked out pretty well in the end, even if I never did actually end up working for a network.
Well, thank you so much for having you on. I'm going to stop the